The day my own family testified against me is the day I learned that betrayal doesn't knock first, it sits across from you in a courtroom and swears to tell the truth. My name is Sibusiso Dlamini, and before I take you into that room with me, do me one thing, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, because this story only gets deeper from here. And I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I'm in South Africa, but I know betrayal speaks every language. Now let me tell you what happened. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the way people were looking at me. Word had spread quickly through our community that I was being accused of manipulating my late grandfather's will. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they knew my family name. The Dlaminis were known for unity, respect, and tradition. That morning, that image was about to crack. I sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit, hands clasped together so no one would see how tightly my fingers were pressing into each other. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was calm, and that calmness unsettled them. Across the room sat my mother, Nomsa Dlamini, wearing a long black dress, her face composed in a way that made her look more like a witness than a parent. Next to her was my older brother, Thabo, shoulders squared like he was preparing for a job interview instead of testifying against his own blood. And beside him sat my uncle, Mandla, the man who used to tell me that, Amdini Yiko Konk, family is everything. That morning, family was the prosecution's strongest weapon. The charges against me were serious: fraud, coercion, and falsifying documents to secure ownership of my grandfather's property in KwaZulu-Natal. According to them, I had taken advantage of an old man in his final months to rewrite history in my favor. The prosecutor stood confidently, adjusting his glasses as he described me as ambitious, strategic, and quietly resentful of my position as the younger son. He told the court that I isolated my grandfather from relatives. That I handled his paperwork suspiciously. That I controlled who visited him. He made it sound sinister. He made it sound believable. And then he called his first witness. Mrs. Dlamini. Hearing my mother's name echo in that room felt unreal. She walked to the stand slowly, lifted her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. I watched her carefully, hoping, foolishly, that she would look at me. She didn't. Do you believe your son manipulated your father into changing his will? The prosecutor asked gently. There was a pause, just long enough to build tension. Yes, she answered. One word. Calm. Certain. That word landed heavier than any accusation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My jaw tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing pain on my face. My mother continued, explaining how I visited my grandfather daily during his illness, how I managed his appointments, and how I insisted on being present during meetings with his lawyer. She framed my involvement as control. She described my dedication as an obsession. The narrative was smooth, practiced. It was clear she had prepared for this. When she stepped down, she still didn't look at me. Then Thabo took the stand. My older brother had always been the golden child, confident, assertive, expected to inherit the family land by tradition. He told the court that our grandfather had always spoken about keeping the property with the eldest. He said I grew distant after university. He claimed I often argued about fairness and equality. He even said he overheard me telling someone that I would make sure things went my way. The way he said it made me sound dangerous. Calculated. As if I had been planning something all along. Uncle Mandla followed, reinforcing their version of events. Their timelines matched perfectly. Their phrases echoed each other. It was too aligned to be spontaneous. Anyone paying close attention could see it had been rehearsed. And as I sat there listening to them build a case against me, I realized something important. They were confident because they believed I was unprepared. They thought I was emotional, hurt, too shocked by their betrayal to think clearly. They believed I would crumble under pressure. What they didn't know was that 3 months earlier, right after my grandfather's will was read and my name was announced as the primary beneficiary of his land, I saw the shift in their eyes. Shock turned to disbelief. Disbelief turned to resentment. That same evening, they called for a family meeting. They said we needed to talk privately, without lawyers, without outsiders. Just us. I remember walking into that meeting thinking we would discuss a compromise. I walked out, realizing something far more dangerous was forming. But that part of the story, the part they desperately hoped would never surface, is coming next. As the courtroom proceedings continued, I noticed the judge observing quietly, pen tapping lightly against his notebook. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay composed." I nodded. Composure was my shield. Because while they were speaking confidently under oath, there was one detail they had forgotten. One small moment they assumed would never matter. And that moment was recorded. If you're still listening, remember this: sometimes the quiet person in the room isn't weak. They're waiting. I'm going to take you inside that family meeting they thought would never leave those four walls. And when you hear what was said, you'll understand why I wasn't afraid in that courtroom. When I left the courtroom that first day, the air outside felt different, heavier somehow, as if even the sky over South Africa had heard what my own mother had said about me. You already know how it felt to sit there while Nomsa Dlamini, Thabo Dlamini, and Uncle Mandla pointed at me like I was a stranger. But what you don't know yet is how we got there. So before I continue, if this story is touching you in any way, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next is the reason I never panic when people lie about me. And I still want to see those comments. Tell me which country you're watching from. Whether you're here in Zanzibar or somewhere across the ocean, betrayal feels the same everywhere. Now let me take you back 3 months earlier, to the day my grandfather's will was read in a small lawyer's office in Durban. The curtains were half drawn, the afternoon sun slipping through in thin golden lines. My grandfather, Ubaba Mthembu, as many in our community called him, had been a respected man. He built everything from nothing. A modest but valuable piece of land just outside Pietermaritzburg, land that carried history, sweat, and pride. When the lawyer cleared his throat and read the final decision, the room was silent. The property, he said carefully, is to be transferred to my grandson, Sibusiso Dlamini. For a second, no one reacted. I felt more confusion than excitement. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't expected it. I had simply been the one who drove him to hospital appointments, who sat beside him when his breathing became shallow, who listened to his stories about the old days when South Africa was a very different place. Then I looked up and saw it, the shift. My brother Thabo's eyebrows tightened. Uncle Mandla leaned back slowly in his chair. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. No one congratulated me. No one said, "Well done for taking care of him." Instead, the lawyer's office suddenly felt too small, too warm. Outside, life carried on, taxis hooting, people walking, vendors calling out, but inside that room, something fragile cracked. That evening, my mother called and said we needed to have a private family discussion. "We can't let lawyers divide us," she said softly. "We are Dlaminis. We solve things at home." Her voice was calm, almost sweet, and for a moment, I believed this would be about unity. I arrived at her house in KwaMashu just after sunset. The smell of cooked rice and chocolate lingered in the air, familiar and comforting. For a brief second, I thought maybe I had imagined the tension earlier. Maybe this was just a shock. We sat around the dining table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays and Christmas lunches. But that night, the chairs felt like positions in a negotiation. Thabo spoke first. "Sbu," he said, using my childhood nickname, "you know, traditionally the eldest carries the responsibility of the land." His tone was controlled, almost rehearsed. Uncle Mandla nodded. "Your grandfather was old. Sometimes old people get confused." I felt my chest tighten. "He wasn't confused," I replied calmly. "He was clear. He explained his reasons to me." My mother finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Then you must understand why this hurts your brother. You've always been independent. You have your career. Thabo has built his life expecting to lead this family." That was the first moment I realized this wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about expectation. They didn't question the will legally. They questioned it emotionally. Thabo leaned forward. "Just transfer the land to me," he said quietly. "We'll handle it as a family asset. You won't lose anything. It just makes sense." Makes sense. I looked at each of them. The land wasn't just soil. It was the last decision my grandfather made with a clear mind. It was his way of saying thank you for the years I spent by his side when others were too busy. "I can't do that," I said gently. Not aggressively. Not definitely. Just honestly. And that's when the sweetness faded. The room grew colder. My uncle's voice lost its warmth. "Don't be selfish, boy." Thabo's jaw tightened. "You're choosing property over blood." My mother didn't raise her voice. She simply said something that echoed in my mind for weeks: "Be careful, Sibusiso. Things can become complicated." At the time, I thought she meant emotionally complicated. I didn't yet understand she meant legally complicated. The meeting ended without shouting, without drama, but with something far more dangerous: silence. As I drove home that night through the dimly lit streets, something didn't sit right with me. Their unity felt too organized. Their arguments sounded aligned. That's when I made a quiet decision. If there were going to be more family discussions, I would protect myself. Not because I wanted to fight them, but because I sensed I might need proof one day. And that instinct, that small whisper telling me to be careful, would become the reason I could sit calmly in that courtroom months later while they testified against me. The second family meeting happened a week after that tense dinner in KwaMashu, and by then I had already learned something important: when people start speaking softly about something that belongs to you, prepare yourself. You already know how my own family stood in a South African courtroom and testified against me. You saw the moment the will was read and the pressure began. Now this is where everything shifted. And before I continue, if you're still here, it means this story is pulling you in for a reason. Make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to hear is the turning point. And don't forget to comment your country below. I want to see how many people understand what it feels like when loyalty is tested. The call came from my Uncle Mandla. His voice sounded lighter than before, almost friendly. "Sibusiso, come by tomorrow evening. Let's clear the air properly. No tension this time." I hesitated, but I agreed. I didn't want to be the one accused of avoiding resolution. When I arrived at his house in Umlotsi, I noticed something immediately. Thabo's car was already parked outside. My mother was too. The porch light flickered slightly, and through the window I could see their silhouettes seated close together. Not scattered. Together. This time, I was ready. Before stepping out of my car, I placed my phone inside my shirt pocket with the recording app quietly running. I didn't feel proud of it. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt cautious. The kind of caution you feel when you sense a trap but can't yet see it. Inside, the atmosphere was calmer than before. Tea was poured. Chairs were arranged in a circle. It almost felt like a peace meeting. For a brief second, I wondered if maybe they had reconsidered. Maybe this would end with understanding. Uncle Mandla started. "We've been thinking carefully," he said, fingers interlocked. "There's a way to fix this without destroying the family." The word destroying hung in the air like a warning. Thabo leaned forward. "Transfer the land to a joint family trust," he suggested. "I'll manage it, but officially it won't just be mine. It will look balanced." Look balanced. Not balanced. Look balanced. I took a slow breath. "Grandfather didn't mention a trust," I replied calmly. "He made a direct decision." My mother's tone shifted slightly. "You're being rigid, Sibusiso. Leadership sometimes means sacrifice." I couldn't help noticing how aligned they were again. Different voices, same direction. When I didn't respond immediately, Thabo's patience began to thin. "Do you know what people are already saying?" he asked sharply. "They're saying you manipulated an old man. That you isolated him." There it was. The seed. The narrative was formed before it ever reached a courtroom. I kept my voice steady. "People can say anything. That doesn't make it true." Uncle Mandla leaned back and sighed loudly. "Courts don't always see the truth. They see consistency. If three of us share concerns, it raises questions." The room went quiet after that sentence. It wasn't a threat, shouted in anger. It was a strategy spoken calmly. My heart beat louder in my ears, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Are you saying you would lie?" I asked softly. No one answered directly. Instead, my mother said something that would later echo in court. "We are trying to protect this family's reputation. If things go legal, it won't look good for you. For me. Not for them." Thabo's voice lowered. "Just sign it over. Otherwise, things could get complicated." That word again. Complicated. I realized then that this wasn't negotiation. It was pressure disguised as concern. They weren't asking me to compromise, they were asking me to surrender. And the confidence in their tone told me they believed they could shape the outcome if I refused. What they didn't realize was that every word was being captured clearly in my pocket. Every pause. Every suggestion. Every calculated sentence. I stood up slowly. "I won't sign anything tonight," I said. "If you want to challenge the will legally, you have that right. But I won't give up something grandfather chose freely." Thabo's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. Maybe I was. Maybe choosing integrity over comfort is always seen as a mistake by those who expect obedience. As I walked out, I heard Uncle Mandla whisper something I would never forget: "He's too emotional. He won't survive cross-examination." They underestimated silence. They underestimated preparation. They underestimated me. Driving home through the humid Durban night, streetlights reflecting on the windshield, I replayed the meeting in my mind. Not with anger. With clarity. I knew then that if this reached court, they would present a united front. They would repeat phrases like concern, confusion, and manipulation. They would rely on numbers. 3 voices against 1. But I also knew something they didn't. I had proof of intent. Proof that the narrative was forming long before any legal complaint was filed. Proof that their unity wasn't born from truth but from strategy. Weeks later, when I was formally served with legal papers accusing me of coercion and document tampering, I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even furious. I was ready. So when one opened in that courtroom, and my mother calmly said, yes, when asked if I manipulated my grandfather, I didn't react. When Thabo claimed I threatened to find a way, I didn't interrupt. When Uncle Mandla spoke about raising concerns, I didn't argue. I'll tell you about the exact moment in court when those private words echoed through speakers for everyone to hear, and how silence became their greatest fear. The courtroom had already heard enough to believe they understood the story. My mother had spoken with calm conviction. My brother had described me as calculating. My uncle had positioned himself as the concerned elder protecting the family legacy. Their version sounded polished, consistent, and believable. 3 voices aligned against one. And if you followed this journey from, you already know what that felt like, sitting there in a South African courtroom while your own blood rewrites your character in front of strangers. But what they didn't know was that the real story had been waiting patiently for its turn. If you're still here, this is the moment everything shifts. Make sure you're subscribed. The reason silence can be more powerful than shouting. The prosecutor finished questioning my Uncle Mandla with visible satisfaction. He glanced briefly toward my side of the courtroom, almost as if expecting me to look defeated. I didn't. I simply adjusted my cuffs and waited. My lawyer, Advocate Naidu, stood slowly. Calm. Unrushed. He thanked the witness politely and asked a few measured questions, nothing aggressive, nothing dramatic. Just small clarifications. Dates. Locations. Exact phrases. Each answer from my uncle matched what my mother and brother had said earlier. Too perfectly. Then Advocate Naidu paused. He looked toward the judge. Your Lordship, he began evenly, the defense would like to present video evidence relevant to the credibility of the witnesses. The words seemed ordinary. But the temperature in the room shifted. My brother's head snapped slightly in my direction. My mother's hands tightened around her handbag. Uncle Mandla blinked slowly, but said nothing. The prosecutor frowned. Video evidence, he asked, clearly unaware of what was coming. Yes, my lawyer replied calmly. A recording from a family meeting held 1 week after the will was read. For the first time during that entire trial, I saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. Not fear yet. Just confusion. They were probably thinking I had recorded a harmless conversation. Something emotional. Something they could explain away. The judge nodded. Proceed. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen position near the front was activated. There was no dramatic soundtrack. No special effect. Just the faint sound of chairs moving and cups clinking. Then voices. Familiar voices. Uncle Mandla's voice came first, clear and unmistakable. Courts don't always see the truth. They see consistency. If 3 of us share concerns, it raises questions. A ripple moved through the courtroom. My uncle's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Then Thabo's voice followed, just sign it over. Otherwise, things could get complicated. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Then my mother's voice, softer, but steady, if things go legal, it won't look good for you. There was no anger in those recordings. That was what made them powerful. They were calm. Strategic. Coordinated. Not the words of worried relatives. The words of people building a narrative. The screen continued playing. My own voice could be heard asking quietly, are you saying you would lie? Silence in the recording. That silence echoed even louder in the courtroom. The judge raised his hand, signaling for the video to pause. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the witnesses seated together. Mrs. Dlamini, he said carefully, would you like to clarify your earlier testimony? My mother's composure cracked for the first time. Her lips parted, But no words came immediately. Thabo avoided eye contact entirely. Uncle Mandla cleared his throat. The prosecutor attempted to recover. Your lordship, family discussions can be misinterpreted. The judge interrupted gently but firmly. The recording appears clear. Advocate Naidu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Your lordship, the defense's position is simple. This case was constructed after the will was read. The witnesses discussed presenting aligned concerns to influence perception. This directly contradicts their sworn statements that their suspicions arose independently. Every word landed precisely. The courtroom was no longer whispering. It was still. Completely still. The kind of stillness that feels like pressure against the ears. I didn't look at my family. I kept my gaze forward. Because this wasn't about humiliating them. It was about revealing truth. The judge requested the remainder of the recording. It played again. The comment from my uncle about cross-examination, Thabo's frustration, the clear implication that unity would create credibility. Each sentence dismantled their coordinated performance from earlier that morning. When it ended, no one moved. The judge removed his glasses slowly. This court takes perjury very seriously, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority that silenced every breath in that room. My mother looked smaller somehow. My brother's confidence had evaporated. Uncle Mandla stared at the floor. The strategy they had crafted in a living room in Umlotsi had followed them into a courtroom and exposed itself under oath. For months they believed numbers would overpower truth. 3 voices against 1. They underestimated documentation. They underestimated preparation. They underestimated the quiet person who chose not to argue but to record. The prosecutor requested a short recess. The judge agreed. As people stood and murmurs filled the room, I remained seated. Not triumphant. Not smiling. Just steady. Because this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. My name, which had been dragged through accusations of fraud and manipulation, was standing upright again. When the court resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. The confidence on the prosecution's side was gone. The narrative they built so carefully now looked rehearsed rather than righteous. And as I sat there, I realized something powerful: truth doesn't need theatrics. It only needs timing. It wasn't explosive. It was precise. It was patient. It was undeniable. I'll tell you how the verdict came down, and what it cost all of us when truth finally spoke louder than blood. When the court reconvened after the recess, the energy in the room had completely changed. The same courtroom that once felt like it was closing in on me now felt still, cautious, almost reflective. If you've walked this journey with me from the beginning, you've seen the accusation, the pressure, the strategy, and the moment the truth echoed through those speakers. It's not just about a verdict. It's about consequences. It's about what happens after the silence. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the witnesses before turning his attention to the legal representatives. His voice was steady, measured, and firm. He stated that the credibility of the prosecution's key witnesses had been severely compromised. He referenced the recording. He mentioned the coordinated language. He pointed out the contradiction between their sworn testimony and their private discussion. Every sentence he spoke felt like a brick rebuilding something that had been torn down. My name. The accusation of fraud collapsed under the weight of its own construction. The court dismissed the primary claims against me, citing insufficient evidence and clear indications of collaborative intent to misrepresent facts. But the judge did not stop there. He addressed the seriousness of providing misleading testimony under oath. He emphasized that the justice system depends on honesty, not strategy. The words perjury and investigation were mentioned carefully but clearly. In that moment, I did not feel victorious. I felt still. Because while the legal pressure lifted from my shoulders, something else settled heavily on my heart. Across the room, my mother stared ahead blankly. Tabo's jaw tightened, but his confidence was gone. Uncle Mandla looked older than he had that morning. The same unity they once relied on now felt fragile. When the session officially ended, the gavel sound was not dramatic. It was final. People began to stand. Murmurs returned. Some looked at me with curiosity. Others with sympathy. A few even nodded quietly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. But I did not rush out. I gathered my files calmly. I shook my lawyer's hand. I thanked him. Then I walked toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the Durban air felt different from the day the trial began. It was the same city, the same sky, the same streets, but my name was no longer carrying suspicion. A local reporter approached carefully and asked, "Mr. Dlamini, how do you feel?" I paused before answering. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer mattered. Truth doesn't shout, I said quietly. It waits. That was it. No insults. No bitterness. No celebration. Because here's what many people don't talk about when justice is served: sometimes you win the case and lose the comfort. I walked to my car alone. Not because I had no family, but because family had chosen a different path. And that reality hurt more than any accusation. But I also understood something powerful. Integrity is not proven when everyone agrees with you. It's proven when you stand alone and remain consistent. I could have reacted emotionally during those meetings. I could have shouted. I could have accused them first. Instead, I prepared. I documented. I stayed calm. Not for revenge. For protection. In South Africa, we often say umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through others. But what happens when those others misunderstand you? What happens when unity becomes pressure instead of support? You learn to stand firmly in your own truth. The land my grandfather left me still exists. The soil has not changed. The grass still grows the same way it did before the courtroom drama. But what that land represents to me now is different. It is not just inheritance. It is a reminder that clarity must be protected. That loyalty should never be blind. That preparation is not paranoia, it is wisdom. As I drove away from the courthouse that day, I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a man who survived something he never expected to face. And survival, when done with integrity, is powerful. If you've been listening from the beginning, let the story remind you of something important: never underestimate the quiet moments where decisions are made. The small choices, to record, to stay calm, to refuse pressure, can shape outcomes months later. And if you ever find yourself standing alone while others speak confidently against you, truth has patience. But this is not the end. Because sometimes the aftermath is more complicated than the trial itself. Rebuilding trust. Facing community whispers. Deciding whether forgiveness is possible. Those are battles that don't happen in courtrooms. They happen in private. And in the next storyline I'm going to share, you'll see what happened when someone unexpected reached out to me weeks after the verdict, someone whose involvement changed everything again. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. So if this story moved you, if it made you reflect on loyalty, truth, or preparation, make sure you're subscribed. And before you go, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I want to know how far this message travels. Because betrayal may be personal, but resilience is universal.